now being recorded. Anybody who misses this session has access to the recording. In fact, everybody has access to the recording. And if you would ever like to refer back to it, I'll give you information on how to access the recording after the meeting. As I mentioned, my name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. And as you probably know by now, the California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. And as Pacific Union agents, you are the first group to take part in our real estate certification program. And though this may be your first foray into formal historic preservation training, we hope it inspires you to become more involved in the protection of historic places across the state. With your registration, you receive one complimentary annual membership to our organization, which entitles you to over 20 other webinars, and as well as a dozen on-site workshops throughout the state. Today's session will look at more than 150 years of architectural styles. Each speaker will cover a time period in chronological order, and we will follow that with a rapid quiz session, 10 examples of architectural styles, where you will test your knowledge of architectural styles for 10 different examples. So the format for today will consist of 2 presentations, totaling over an hour in length, and we will close with a 15-minute question and answer period. You may be pulled from time to time. Don't be alarmed if it covers your screen. It will only briefly appear during polling, and then it will disappear when the presentation resumes. You'll notice there's also a chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You may use that chat box at any time if you'd like to comment, interject, or ask any questions. If you are connected to a mobile device using the Adobe Connect mobile app, certain interactive features may not be available to you, but you should still be able to watch and listen to the presentation. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access when it asks to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time, and this will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. I'm now going to introduce today's speakers. Caitlin Harvey is an architectural historian with a background in practical preservation methods, as well as historical research and writing. After completing a master's degree in historic preservation at the University of Oregon, she has spent the last 9 years taking the lead on a wide variety of projects, which have included 12 major historic resource surveys and historic context statements, 4 successful National Register nominations, and numerous Historic American Building Survey projects, federal tax applications, Section 106 assessments, EIR, cultural resource components, and historic resource evaluations. In 2010, Ms. Harvey established Left Coast Architectural History, and has continued to focus on providing quality historic resources consulting in California. Left Coast Architectural History provides historic resource and preservation consultation for individual clients as well as project support for environmental, architecture, and historic resources consulting firms. Ms. Harvey's recent work has ranged from an isolated cabin site in the Sequoia National Park to the urban streets of San Francisco's Bayview District. As a fourth-generation Californian, she feels a deep personal connection to the history of the state. Coming from a family of architects and interior designers, and with an undergraduate degree in art history, Ms. Harvey has a strong background in history, art, and architecture that she directs with great enthusiasm toward her ongoing work. Our second speaker, Jonathan Lammers, has over 15 years of experience researching and documenting cultural resources. He served as the lead researcher and writer for the Benicia Pacific Grove, Pebble Beach, and Elk Grove city-wide historic context statements, as well as the Central SOMA historic context statement for the city of San Francisco. He has documented buildings, districts, and landscapes for large-scale historic resource surveys, including the Market and Octavia South of Market, and Mission District surveys in San Francisco, as well as the Richmond Prism Historic Survey. He currently prepares historic resource evaluation responses in support of current planning efforts, and also prepares individual landmark nominations as part of San Francisco's landmark designation work program. At this moment, I'm going to mute all of the participants, but if at any time, and if you're on a phone line, you'd like to unmute yourself, you will press the *6 on your phone.
Go through this and just
1 second while I mute everybody.
I don't know when the quiz comes up or anything.
All right, Jonathan, you are ready to begin.
Can you hear me, John? I just want to make sure of that.
Yes, I do.
All right, we're still going good to go there?
Yes, we're ready to go here. Yep.
Forgive me. Hi, this is Jonathan Lammers. As John mentioned, I work as a historic preservation technical specialist for the City of San Francisco for the Planning Department. I'm really glad to be participating in this just because I always enjoy talking about historic architecture in Northern California. The slides you have in front of you, we developed earlier for one that was San Francisco specific, and I'm going to try and broaden the discussion a little bit to the greater Bay Area, but a lot of the details that are on the buildings, you'll see on older buildings throughout the Bay Area. The main difference is that in San Francisco, of course, we have narrower lots, so we usually only see the front or a little bit of the sides of buildings, whereas in portions of the East Bay, North Bay, and South Bay, you're much more likely to see a house freestanding on its lot. And so you might have a chance to see a lot more details and ornament, but the same general rules apply. John also mentioned some of you also sell properties in San Francisco, so hopefully this will be good for you all as well. So goals of this, I'm going to talk primarily about Victorian era properties in the Bay Area, and I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, you're able to identify some of them or have an idea of what the style is and when they were built. And a big one for me is also getting to know the difference between Victorian and Edwardian. I see so many mentions in the real estate advertisements that often confuse the two, so I'm gonna try and hone in on that one when we come to it. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and this is just big picture, is that there's really no such thing as a pure example of an architectural style, or sometimes there'll be the textbook case, but styles are, they're more on a continuum. Sometimes you have buildings that have elements of multiple styles being mixed at the same time, and that's okay. We end up saying, this building is built with a combination of stickies like in Queen Anne influences or something like that. So I don't want you to feel bad when you see a property that looks like it has a little bit of two things. That's entirely possible. One of the things I think that's really interesting also is just sort of a big picture item is that a lot of the buildings that we have here that are made out of redwood are actually meant to imitate buildings that were constructed in stone, and this is particularly true of the Italianate style, which we'll come to in a moment. But everything happened in San Francisco generally a little bit later than it happened in the East. So when these buildings, these brownstones, and were going up in places like New York and Philadelphia, they attempted to copy that out here, but it was a lot easier to build things out of redwood because it was abundant and cheap. And so that's what we ended up getting. So it'll help sometimes to think about styles trying to emulate ones that were developed or first became popular back in the eastern United States. This is specific to San Francisco, but if you're working in the city, I just wanted to let you know, or if you're just visiting, the red area there is the area that burned in 1906. And so you're not going to find any Victorian-era properties there. And we call it Victorian because it was during the reign of Queen Victoria in England, who reigned all the way up until her death in 1900, I believe, from the 1840s. So a huge period. And so all the housing styles that came out during her reign, they get this sobriquet of Victorian. And similarly, when she passed away, her son Edward became King Edward, acceded to the throne, and he reigned from 1900 to 1910, and that's why that's called the Edwardian period, although here in San Francisco it's often applied to anything built around the turn of the century. We call Edwardian sometimes. I'm going to start off with the earliest architectural style you're likely to see here in the Bay Area. It gets different names, but National Style is as good as any, is because they built these all the way across the country. So National Style, it went west with the railroads, and it's a very simple form. It has a gable roof, and I'm going to explain some of these terms. Get the arrow here if I can get it to come up. Gable roof, a gable just means this little angle in the middle. That is a gable roof, and you see them everywhere. So they're simple and easy to build, and when these were originally constructed in San Francisco, they often had a little front porch like this. And if you look at old engravings of the city, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of houses like this. These are built 1850s to the 1870s, but in some cases they went later because it's such a simple form. So don't always assume that because you see a building like this, it's going to have been built in 1860. You could have a farmhouse that was built in 1910 that looks like this as well. Some of the clues that this one is old is they've have what called little hoods here above the window, and we'll see those with some other styles. And also a good clue to something having been constructed during the Victorian era is the property setback. If you look here, you have a little postage stamp front yard, and you see that not only in San Francisco, but with Victorian era properties throughout the Bay Area, because they'd like to have a garden in front of the house, sometimes very ample gardens for some of the mansions in the East Bay and North Bay, South Bay. But that is usually a good clue. Later on, they build right out there to the property line. You know, the front of the building is right here at the street where this site wall is. But during the 19th century, buildings usually have a pretty ample front setback. And I'm just going to scroll through a couple of examples. On the left are some neighborhoods you might see them in San Francisco. And again, you can see them in old neighborhoods throughout the Bay Area, parts of West Oakland for sure, and scattered about in the oldest sections of town throughout the Bay Area. And here's another one. Again, you've got that simple gable roof, you've got the front porch, you've got the setback. In this case, we've got a little wrought iron decorative site wall. That's also common on older properties as well, particularly in San Francisco. And yet another one, very simple form. And here's one that's been altered. Somebody's put asbestos shingles on it and ripped off all of the ornament and put in terrible sliding aluminum windows. But one of the clues of the age here is we had this big, big setback. So we know that this was built a long time ago. And here are some properties. These are the Tanforan cottages. If you've ever visited Mission Dolores in San Francisco, these are right up the street. These were constructed during the 1850s. Another style that was going on around the same period was the Gothic Revival style. And as the name implies, it was sort of based on Gothic precedents. But here in the West, these buildings weren't huge stone cathedrals. They were, again, usually built out of redwood. And some of the character-defining features of this style are steep gable roofs with decorated barge boards. And these are these wide boards here that you see in the gable end up here. You see that a bunch. In church architecture, which it was used for the most, you see pointed arch windows. Generally, you don't see a lot of houses in this style, but they are scattered around. Occasionally, you're going to see what's going to look like a little gingerbread house, and that is a good clue that it's the Gothic Revival style. Here's a Gothic Revival church. You've all probably seen this many, many times. This persisted a long time for houses. The style fell out of favor, probably by the 1870s, but for churches it was built well into the 20th century and continues to influence church design. And again, whenever you see some of the San Francisco neighborhoods on the left-hand side, that's just where you might be inclined to see it. And here's a little tiny example of a Gothic Revival building. Again, we've got the decorated barge boards that I mentioned earlier, so I'm trying to get that arrow arrow to go for me again down here, but it's not dragging. If you look in the gable end, there's sort of little scroll cuts that go through it and a little finial just to decorate it. Otherwise, it's a really, really simple building. Now I've got my pointer back. There we go. And here's another one in San Francisco. The real hallmark of the style is you're looking for something like that. Sometimes they look like icicles hanging down in the gable end. Those are all sort of Gothic Revival National Style mix. So now I'm going to flip over to one that you're really likely to see more frequently throughout the Bay Area, because this is a style that first came on really in the 1860s and then became the defining style of the 1870s and early 1880s. And this style, called flat front Italianate, it's very similar to the previous one. Remember, we just had a sort of gable roof here at the front of the building? Well, that gable roof is still there. It's just hiding behind what we call the parapet. And you can see, again, that it's a false front. It's trying to make the building look more impressive, trying to make it look a little bit taller, a little bit like those row houses that you'd see in New York and Boston and so forth. But essentially, it's the same building. They've prettied it up a little bit with that flat front on it. And again, you see the window hoods are used here, and usually they have brackets. And most often you see these buildings clad with what's called rustic channel siding. It's this wood siding where you can see these sort of deep grooves in it, and that gets used an awful lot. And again, that's not just in San Francisco, but throughout the Bay Area. Some of the neighborhoods on the left, you might see these in San Francisco, but again, you can find them generally in urban areas more so than in suburban areas or rural areas is where you're going to see this type of building. And here's a little grouping of them in the Mission District. I should point out that some of these were, it wasn't always just a single family house. Here, these are multi-family buildings. We have an entrance for the unit on the top up here, and then we have another one here, and here the two are side by side. And there's another one that's a multi-unit building. And yet another. Sometimes the window hoods are not just a flat, but you get a little arch pediment here. And sometimes you get a shaped parapet. We call it sometimes a tabbed parapet. And then there's the other common Italianate style building, which is just the bay window Italianate. And these are probably familiar to a lot of people. And indeed, these are going to set the tone for what's going on in San Francisco for quite some time, because a lot of the features you see on these buildings are going to persist into the early 20th century. This building, what they've done is, when you see the bay window Italianates, they're a little bit more expensive when they were built, so they get a little bit finer craftsmanship, a little bit more detail. The angled bay window is this sort of three-sided bay window, and it's very much like the flat-fronted building, except we've just put a bay window on it. And oftentimes the entries are accentuated. In this case, we've got a little balconette that they've put above the entry and some brackets there. We also have windows that aren't perfectly square. These have a little bit, they've carved off the edges. Sometimes these are arched windows you see a lot in Italianate properties. And another one that's a good clue to this style are these little blocks that we've done here on the side. These are called coins, and they're just meant to imitate stonework, to look like masonry. You would see these buildings that have this sort of bay window look throughout the Bay Area. Again, if you're in portions of the East Bay that had a more ample lot than San Francisco, you might see the bays on more than one side. But this is a fairly common, again, urban expression of the style. And here's one where we've just got the bay window on the first story and not above. And another one where we've got a bay window here on the side. And we've got a nice entry portico here. And here's a little group of them. You have a flat front Italianate and then two bay window Italianates. And again, if you look at them, you can see that setback from the front of the lot line. So it tells you that's a good clue to age, almost always. And here we have, this is one building, but it's been subdivided into condominiums and is now three separate parcels, but it's all the same building. and another grouping. These were mass-produced. One of the things that people sometimes think with Victorians that these were, master handcrafted buildings. They're actually really a function of the Industrial Revolution, the availability of lots of milled lumber and lots of ornament and the ability to order windows from catalogs and things like that. The difference with Victorian properties that sets them apart is they generally have better materials because you've got old growth redwood in them, which is very resistant to rot and decay. So I always tell people, if at all possible, you're not going to see materials again like that in our lifetime, certainly not in this quantity, and maybe not in several future lifetimes before we see wood of that quality again. And again, you'll often see them in groups in older parts of the city because they built a lot of buildings in this style. The next one that followed sort of came on in the 1880s, and it's here we often call it stick Eastlake or the stick style. Stick style is really an emphasis on lots of wooden elements. They sort of just throw imagine if you took a bunch of pickup sticks and threw them on a building. That's sort of where that stick name comes from. But one of the easiest ways to tell it apart from, say, the Italianate style, which just preceded it, is usually instead of an angled bay, you get a square bay window rising up. And then you start seeing these brackets that are rising up to the roof line, and they carry through down to the windows. And instead of coins, we've got these corner boards that go all the way down the building. Just a lot of linear emphasis on this. So that's a good indicator of the stick style. This one is this one's sort of a unusual example, but it gives you a good idea of what I'm talking about. Just lots and lots of linear wood ornament on the front of the building. This is another common device you see a lot up in the gable end here. We see this sort of decorative truss sticking around. We see all these little bits of trim up here beneath the gable end, and also here at the roof line along with the brackets. Those are all good clues that you're dealing with a stick style building. And here's some more. These are sort of unusual. They have, we talked about the decorative barge boards that you would see in the Gothic Revival style, but here they're being used along with a little bit of a truss and finial element in these buildings. But again, the square bay is one of your big clues. And another one that was used a lot during this period, decorative motifs, the Eastlake style was popular in furniture. And if you ever see old furniture that looks like it has lots of little lines carved into the wood, that was popular. That also happened with ornament on these buildings. Again, mentioned the mass-produced aspect. In some cases, whole blocks were built in this style. This is actually in San Francisco's Mission District. And here are some in the Haight-Ashbury area. But again, you really see all that sort of linear stuff in the boxed bay. So if nothing else you take from this, if you see that, two-story building with an angled bay window and it looks old, it's probably a bay window Italianate. If you see a similar building and it's got that box bay window and lots of linear ornament, you can say that's stick Eastlake. And here's just a little corner commercial building. Could be expressed different ways. This one doesn't have as much of that linear sort of element to it, but it does have the square bay windows. And again, more of them, another popular style. I sort of think of this one as the one that followed the expansion of the streetcars. A lot of lines were built during the 1880s, not just in San Francisco, but around the Bay Area, and this style sort of followed those streetcar lines. And here's a duplex. And some little single-family examples. Here again, the square bay and maybe some other little bits of ornament. Buildings of this age, sometimes I haven't seen a bunch of the examples I've shown you, but sunbursts are a common decorative motif that were used during this period. I brought this one up just for fun. We'll go to the preceding picture. As I said, they were built in mass. Sometimes they get altered in mass at the same time. So in the 1920s or 30s, the stucco salesman came around and said, hey, I can make your building into a little Mediterranean revival cottage if you'd like, and stuccoed the front and put on some red clay tile. But there's an original one right here sitting in a group, but they all originally looked like this building, and they were all altered at the same time. So the next major style, and this is the one of all the Victorian styles that you're most likely to see throughout the Bay Area simply because the population numbers were getting up and cities were developing more, is the Queen Anne style. And one of the hallmarks of, I'm showing you some transitional examples here. These are sort of, here's a stick Eastlake building over on the right-hand side. And now we're getting ones, and again, very stick here, but we're starting to get some motifs that are going to be more indicative of Queen Anne. And one of those is pattern shingle work is a big one. So here we see sort of these fish scale shingles up here. Windows with multicolored edges are sometimes called Queen Anne style windows simply because they're of that age. And here we have a sunburst motif used in stick Eastlake, also used with Queen Anne quite a bit. So we have buildings here that are combining elements of two styles. This is, as you all know, the sort of postcard view from Alamo Square. You can always keep this in your head and just think those are all Queen Annes. That's a row of Queen Annes, all built during the 1890s. Say 1895 is usually a good guess when you're dealing with this style. It persisted into the early 20th century, but the mid-1890s is in the Bay Area when it was really at its height. One of the things with Queen Anne buildings is they're usually asymmetrical. They're profusely ornamented, more so than any other Victorian style. They often have porches that have spindle work. If you ever look at a porch and you see, they sometimes call it ball and rod, so it looks like balls hanging on carved out on a piece of wood that's coming down, or decorative trim that's running across the top of a porch. That's a good example, a good indicator of the Queen Anne style as well. Some neighborhoods you're likely to see them. I'm just going to skip through that. There's three main variations. I think everybody recognizes the tower houses when you have sort of a rounded corner tower. That's almost always going to be a Queen Anne style building. And then you have gable front two-story houses, which have that angled bay window you saw with Italianate, but now you've got a little bit more riot of ornament and usually different sort of cladding. You might have the fish scale shingles in the gable end. You might have channel drop siding on one story. So it's sort of a mix and match. And indeed, that was possible because you could order from catalogs during this period and just sort of pick out the ornament you want. And then this is another very common one. This is just a Queen Anne cottage, and they built a ton of these because they weren't that expensive, and they provided affordable housing for both working class and middle class folks, and they were built all across the Bay Area. Here's a row of them. This is in the Haight-Ashbury area. We've got a corner tower house and then some of these two-story houses. There's another one with a tower. And here's a group of them again, the Haight. I think these are called the Seasons because they have different motifs. This building is winter with a big snowflake on it. And here's another one that is this sort of flared roof line is going to be used for another style called the shingle style, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But again, get that idea that there's different elements from different styles can be combined. But this is, we'll call this a Queen Anne because we've got this nice prominent tower there. Here's some more examples. The spindle work I mentioned at the porch, there's that element there. That's the spindle work. Another grouping of them. You might have decoration again here in this little gable end, little garlands, swags, whatever you wanted to throw at it, they did during this period. They really, there was no restraint in terms of ornamenting these buildings. And here's some groups of cottages. Oftentimes these were built, a developer might build an entire block or half a block of these, and another guy competing with him built the other side of the block. This was just a period of a lot of mass building going on. These are nice. Again, here's the fish scale shingles I'm talking about, which you see a bunch, and both of these also have spindle work trim. for their front porches. And here's another little grouping. I know I'm showing lots of examples, but I think it helps just to see a bunch. At least I think that way. One of the ways you get good at styles is just learning to recognize the patterns, if you will. Here's some more. These actually have square bay windows on them, but we'll call them the Queen Anne because we've got some of the difference in cladding, and also these are they're becoming simpler, so we might call these late Queen Anne because we're not seeing, there's no more spindle work, but we've still got the same form that was being used a few years before, but now we're starting to transition to a cleaner, more modern 20th century look, if you will. Same thing here with this cottage. We've got some fish scale shingles on it, but otherwise this is a pretty simple building. And again, these are sort of early 20th century transitional stuff. After the riot of ornament that had happened during the 1880s and 1890s, people sort of got tired and they wanted to go for a cleaner look. And in particular, after the 1906 earthquake, the city was rebuilt. They didn't really rebuild in any of the Victorian styles anymore. They thought they were going for something that was more clean and modern looking. And all the buildings you're seeing here are sort of built during that transition period during the first decade of the 20th century. So these are still, you might call them Queen Anne cottages, but they're much simpler in terms of their ornament. Another one here. And this is another transitional one. We've still got a little bit of a corner tower here, but if you cover up the top of this building, we've got what's coming next, which is the buildings of the Edwardian era. Now, a lot of you might recognize these. They tended to be built most often in San Francisco, but again, you see them in urban areas, older downtown areas throughout the Bay Area, and you see some of the same devices used on freestanding houses too. One of the hallmarks, I would say, of this period is you get a change in cladding. Here, tended to use flush wood siding more often, so it has a flatter sort of aspect when you look at it. This isn't stucco, it's wood, but they place the boards together pretty closely on edge, so it gives a cleaner look to it. What they kept from earlier periods is a ornamental cornice, which is, the cornice again is this part, the hat at the top of the building, or the brim of the hat that sticks out, and they use these little modillions here, or brackets. Egg and dart molding and dental molding. Dental molding is like these little teeth that you see running along here, and egg and dart, really, really common, used during the first, say, 15 years of the 20th century. And here's some of the hallmarks of the style. Angled or curved bay windows a lot. Again, I mentioned the tongue and groove or the flush wood siding. And after 1915, they're still going to keep building this style of building, but they're going to start cladding it with stucco. Right around 1915, that's the transition. In the Bay Area, everything, I won't say everything, it's mainly wood up until that point, and afterwards it's going to be mainly stucco. Of course, you can find old buildings that are done with brick or have stone facades and things on that. I'm speaking in a general sense. And here's some examples of buildings that were all built after the 1906 earthquake. They're a lot, to my mind, they're cleaner looking, if you will, than the Queen Anne buildings that preceded them. There's also an emphasis on classicism, and by classicism, I say we've got, sort of Greek columns. These are used a lot around porches. We've got keystones, which are these little ornamental things in the top of these arches. And again, we've got this very prominent cornice. Here's some more of them. And again, I get back to that sort of clean aspect. If you compare this to the Queen Anne style buildings from 10 or 15 years before, you can see there really is a reaction. This is the IKEA homes of their day, if you will. It's sort of a freestanding house, but has a lot of those hallmarks I'm talking about. And some more. I'm just going to keep, these were also used a lot for corner buildings in older sections of cities, this style. And yet another one. I'm sorry, yes, I'll speak louder. I saw the note there. Um, and as this era is coming to a close, we see other styles that are starting to come in, and of course, Caitlin's going to talk about them in a little bit. But here we have a building that is a little commercial building. It's sort of Edwardian era in most of the building, but up here we have a Spanish clay tile roof, which is showing the influence of the Mission Revival style, which is just starting to come on in popularity during this period. One thing I want to point out, square bay in the center, angled bay at the end. What's differentiating this from the Italianate with the angled bay window is we're just seeing it's overall a little bit cleaner looking. And again, the square bay that you might have seen with the stick Eastlake, we don't have all those stick elements. Mainly it's that roof line that's a good indicator, in the classic columns, keystones, that was just used a ton during this period. And they could build some rather large and substantial buildings that way. Sometimes you'll see buildings with a really heavy cornice, like this one. That's really like the building's wearing a very heavy hat. It's not common, but you'll see it. Here's another one that's cut from the same cloth. And just some more examples. One thing, this is particular to San Francisco, but if you see a building like this, just another term, they call them Romeo flats. These were built only for a very brief period after the 1906 earthquake. They actually sort of got outlawed by the building code because people thought that they encouraged tenement housing. But when you see buildings that have this open balcony here on the stairwells, usually set between story heights, they call those Romeo flats because that's where you could stand out on the balcony and say, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And here's a little bit more, the more classical devices used on this one with this big colonnade, but the same basic idea. Hard to think of it as tenement-style housing when these flats rent for $4,000 a month now. Here's a very different style that is coming on at the exact same time throughout the Bay Area, and it's showing the influence of the shingle style from the east. But out here, we'd like to call our stuff special and be different in the Bay Area. And so it gets called the first Bay tradition, which comes from the shingle style. This was used primarily for homes of the wealthy and often artists, people who wanted to be very different. This was seen as sort of dovetailing with the arts and crafts style, which was coming into popularity at the same time. One of the things you always see with this, or almost always see, is some shingle cladding somewhere. They're usually designed by architects. You often see windows that have art glass or some sort of decorative motif to make it stand out. In San Francisco, you see them primarily in the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. You might see a bunch of them in the portions of Berkeley. Anywhere there was maybe a artistic or bohemian enclave or wealthy people who wanted to live, aspired to be bohemian in their outlook, you saw these buildings being built around the turn of the 20th century. Here we see one that has the sort of gambrel roof that we associate with Dutch colonial revival, but we would still call this shingle or first Bay tradition. From the shingle style, one of the things they did are these very steep gabled roof lines and the little flared eaves that come out there. See how the roof line at the very end kind of swoops out? You see that frequently. There's another example. A lot of these that I'm showing you are from Presidio Heights area. And they got used in combination. This building, you could say it has a lot of strong elements of the colonial revival style, which is also popular at this time, but they've clad it in shingles. Here's one that's got a corner tower, like Queen Anne House, but again, we're using the shingles on it, so we'll call it shingle or first Bay tradition. Same thing here again. As you can see, I'm throwing a lot of examples at you, but I'm trying to say there's, even among architectural historians, we can talk about different styles and say, well, it has more of this influence or more of that influence. It's not always pure. And some more. And then I'll talk about another one that sort of you see elements from this style. You also used in the shingle style and also in combination with some other styles. The Craftsman style, I think we're all familiar with the Craftsman bungalow. Some of the defining elements of this, use of a gable roof, exposed brackets and knee braces in the gable end, exposed rafter tails here at the roof line. They didn't cover it with any fascia board. They let the building show its structure, or they faked the building showing its structure more often to make it look like these are, this might have been put on decoratively, but it's meant to look like you can really see the construction of the house. Thus the craftsman element in all of it. Another thing you see commonly here are windows with divided glass in the upper sash only, not in the bottom. And these are, again, this is specific to San Francisco, but you see these throughout the Bay Area. In fact, I would argue that they are the most common style building you'll see between 1905 and 1915 anywhere in the Bay Area. And so there you see sort of a traditional Craftsman bungalow. You can also see sort of, here's a funky take on it, but you still see those sort of exposed knee braces in the gable end. And here's a townhouse that's maybe doesn't look exactly like a classic bungalow, but you can see the element in the gable end. That's what's given it why you'd call it a Craftsman, is because of that detail. Another classic bungalow. You see these used a lot in home commercials, like, this is what the idealized home for the holidays house is. I see anytime I see a home improvement show, I see Craftsman bungalows shown more than anything else. There's a very nice example. And a more simple example, they could be built for wealthy people. They could be built for, a guy who worked as an iron sheet worker for his housing. They were democratized housing for sure. One of the things you see used a lot is clinker brick as an accent. Clinker brick is just meant to look like brick that misfired, looked like it broke into chunks and had maybe a darker color, like it burned in the kiln. They like to mix and match that, and architects liked the effect. So you see that used a lot for things like chimneys. The last one I'm going to talk about here is the Colonial Revival style. This is happening at the same time as Craftsman, at the same time as Edwardian, at the same time as Shingle. These are all happening at exactly the same time. They're overlapping. And this just had to do with America hearkening back to its early days, sort of a fondness and a romanticized notion of the colonial era in America. Some of the things you see, usually it's a balanced, symmetrical facade. You can cut the facade in half and fold it over and get the same thing. Dormer windows get used a lot, and a dormer window is just a window that peeks out from the roof line. Again, you get some classical details, classical columns you see being used here on the building corners. And there are many, many houses like this all across the Bay Area. Again, commonly built before the 1906 earthquake, but afterwards as well. And when I mentioned the earthquake, it's not, that wasn't just a San Francisco phenomenon. A lot of people moved out of San Francisco, and so neighborhoods all over the Bay Area boomed with people who had left the city. And so you see a big pulse of development all over the Bay Area, and that's why you see a lot of bungalows at that time, and you see a lot of these Colonial Revival style houses. A lot of them also have a very sort of square massing, a box. Sometimes simpler examples they call the American four-square style. I see a question that says, are balustrades common in Colonial Revival homes? Not necessarily more so than any other one. The decoration of the porch is, the way that that's detailed. You can get a lot of decoration above that from the 1870s going forward, and then balustrades are also, this is the balustrade here I think they're reacting to, which is at the top of this. I would say it's not necessarily, you see it quite frequently with buildings from this era. You also see it a lot in city architecture at the time. Some of the steps maybe in Pacific Heights, things like that, City Hall, any building that's wanting to look like it's, wealthy and important, they would use these balustrades, which is the sort of turned wood elements here. So I wouldn't say it's it's not necessarily with every one, but during this era it's common. You just never see them used with craftsman-style buildings, and not so much with Edwardian either. But you could see that an element like this used frequently throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. So here we have some more. There's not necessarily a balustrade at all, but we've got a dental roof line here. And no dormers on this one, but for lack of a better description, we'll say Colonial Revival. This is sort of a classic Colonial Revival house, and this does have the balustrade for sure, and it's got the dormer windows. This is maybe if you wanted to put it in an architecture book and say, here's a good Colonial Revival house, they might show that red one. And here's a little bit more simpler example. Another simpler one. This has got the shingle cladding that we saw before, but just the overall square massing in the dormer window, we'll call it Colonial Revival. And here's a much more ornate example as your balustrade and our dormer windows, but we've got a broken pediment here, and then the gable ends, and very classical, very formal. And then we go immediately to a much less formal example. And this is just a variation on the Colonial Revival style, the Dutch Colonial Revival, which is the gambrel roof, which sort of has this 4 segments, if you will, sort of make, a lot of people think of a barn or something like that, and that was used a bunch. Okay, that brings me to the end of my segment, and I'm going to get ready to turn it over to Caitlin. I just want to thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoyed it, and with that, I turn it to Caitlin.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to briefly merge Caitlin's name with her phone number. So give me a second, Caitlin, here, and it'll just take me a minute. Okay, you're ready to go, Caitlin.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to now address the second half of our range of styles, and this kind of falls into the 20th century entirely. So Jonathan covered the Victorian era, and I'll look at things that come a little later on. We kind of decided that a good differentiation between the two time periods, I guess, is the wooden city and the stucco city. So at this point, a lot of the architecture that's clad in wood is going to start transitioning to stucco. And it's interesting because both materials, like Jonathan was saying, the wood was often made to look like stone or to mimic stone. And in the same sense, this new material that came about in the early 20th century, stucco, was intended to look like stone or, some kind of masonry finish. And so it kind of took the place of wood in cladding buildings, often though the buildings were still wood frame underneath. So in both cases, you were trying to kind of fool the eye into thinking that this building was much more substantial than it actually was. Although, of course, wood is kind of the native material around here, so it was what you built out of. These two photos that I'm showing here are both little bungalows, and I've put the question transitional or altered. There was a point where buildings style started to, or materials started to transition between the wood and the stucco. There was often an overlap. You would see Edwardian buildings covered in stucco. You could also see many later buildings clad in wood. So it's not a really definite dividing line, but you have to sometimes have a keen eye to see whether a building like maybe the one on the right was originally clad in shingles and might have been reclad in stucco when that became more popular. There's always the chance that those kind of alterations could have taken place and that a building might be earlier than the stucco would indicate. Okay, so the first style I'm going to address is Mission Revival, and I think Jonathan kind of started to get into the revival styles back with the Colonial Revival that he was showing. Starting in the early 20th century, there became this very strong movement towards reviving old styles. you wanted to harken back to the good old days of, with the mission revival style, they were trying to evoke early California and the Spanish mission. Other styles I'll get into later go as far back as the medieval era. They were trying to reference something more permanent and grandiose than the barely born Western region might otherwise have had. So we were a very new country at that point. And so referencing old European styles was popular. The mission style, you can think of any of the California missions up and down the coast and kind of come up with the character-defining features of this style. I think the most prevalent is probably that shaped parapet. It's the taco bow parapet here. Those are very indicative of the missions. You also have heavy projecting wood beams and wood members sticking out of walls. And here the stucco is trying to imitate adobe. Clay tile roofs are also obviously a reference to the missions. And they would often have tent roofs like these, which would stick out from the wall as a little awning. You'd have a lot of arches or arcades, mostly not necessarily in windows so much, although you will find them there, but often in doorways and porches and entries. And then they also made these walls that appeared very thick and sturdy, you know, to imitate the adobe again. So like I was saying, the walls are actually made of wood. It's a wood frame building, but they would give them such thickness and use the stucco in such a way that they were imitating thick, massive adobe bricks. So here's a couple more examples. The one on the left seems like it might be a little more suburban in a wider yard where it's allowed to be a little more sprawling. And the one on the right is in San Francisco, so it's confined to a narrower lot. But as you can see, they both provide a very dominant front with that shaped parapet up at the top. And in both cases, they hide a gable roof behind. So it's a little bit of a false front situation, but I think that shaped gable parapet is the most indicative aspect of the style. And next we would go to Spanish colonial revival. So again, they're a little hard to differentiate, but I would say that parapet is the most obvious thing. Spanish colonial, again, they're trying to reference the ideal days of the haciendas in California and evoke that rural Western atmosphere. So these get a little more ornate, though, and so I think that's another differentiating aspect, is you could say that the mission revival style is a little more rustic and rudimentary, whereas the Spanish colonial becomes more refined, and it starts incorporating things like this decorative spindle work and tile work that's very colorful, impressed stucco around surrounds and things, and shaped wood brackets. Again, the stucco is kind of mimicking adobe, and then you have the red tile roofs and the arches and arcades. This one's an interesting example. It has parabolic arches, which you don't see very often, but it still creates that arcade impression. Oh, and Churrigueresque is a really good term. It indicates the real ornate, twisted spindles and impressed designs. There's a bunch over here by the entry, although it's a little small to see. But anytime the medallions and the pendants and things get real ornate, you can call that Churrigueresque. It's a good artistic term. Here's a couple more examples that are a little more suburban and sprawling. This one up here has a real good example of arcades. And then the one down, on the chimneys too, you'll often see these little caps that also have the red clay tile, and also might have some arches and arcading going on. The one down at the bottom I put in there because it kind of represents the Monterey colonial style, which is a style is near and dear to my heart, but you'll find those that they're Spanish colonial, but they mimic the Spanish colonial style that was really prevalent in Monterey. And it's pretty specific to that city authentically, but then the revival style spread nationwide. And the kind of indicative element of that is a second floor balcony or veranda. It can be two-story or it can be just on the upper story, and it will have a big sweeping area for outdoor space raised up above the first story. If you want to look up the Larkin House at some point, that's an authentic example of that style. So another kind of derivative revival style is the Mediterranean revival. And my key to remembering this as versus the others is that it feels a little more Italian than Spanish. If you have a good sense of those two aesthetics, that helps. But again, it has stucco cladding, it has red clay tile roofing. It also has parapets and tent roofs. This parapet is shaped like the ones in Mission Revival, but it's just got a different, it's not quite as pronounced, it's not quite as curvy, and often it won't, in Mediterranean style, won't be curvy, it'll be stepped or some other tabbed version. In the Mediterranean revival, you'll get a lot of applied small-scale ornaments. So you'll have things like these tiles up here, or you'll have little molded medallions or swags that are applied directly to the wall. And it's interesting to note those are typically very manufactured ornaments. So it's kind of like the gingerbread in the Queen Anne style, where people have gone, ordered these from a pattern catalog, and you would get the little garland ornaments or whatever and apply it. It's kind of very superficial. They're never really applied in much profusion or any great ornateness, but they're just kind of stuck to the wall. So I think where I noted here Renaissance influences, that's again that kind of Italian aesthetic. This one doesn't show it so well. I think some of the later ones do, so I'll show you there. But you know, you'll have some classical elements that are worked in that kind of evoke the Renaissance. So this is an urban example. Obviously, it's hemmed in by buildings on either side. And so I would say in San Francisco or in really kind of compact urban areas, you're going to find this particular facade organization a lot, where you're going to have a garage on the first story topped by some kind of bay window, and then you'll have an entrance that's either on the side here and raised up to the second story level, or you will have it down on the first story next to the garage and recessed in a similar kind of arched entryway. So here's some other examples of Mediterranean revival. The one on top is very ornate. This is actually the Phelan McGinnis Mansion that's in Pacific Heights, and it's clad with brick, and it has the red clay tile roofs. And I think this is where I can definitely point out the Renaissance influence in these doorways here. You'll have little pediments and things that are surrounding doorways. This upper story loggia is also kind of Renaissance inspired. And then here's another urban example that's a little more ornate than the one that I showed previously. So they have a lot more of those applied medallions, little garlands and recessed areas. But this is actually a building that I did a report on, and you know, it was owned and commissioned by a rather wealthy family. So that kind of denotes the more profusion of ornaments denotes a higher income level. I think you could afford more of the medallions and the decorative detailing, and also these really fabulous windows with a crazy mutton pattern that's pretty ornate. And then we go into the French Provincial, so we're making a tour of the Mediterranean and Europe. Again, this is stucco clad, but we are getting away from the red tile roofs, and instead we have a mansard roof, or a mansard-esque roof. If you're not familiar, the mansard roofs in Paris are the kind of two-planed roofs. They're not so much a gambrel roof, but they're more of a hipped roof that's got two planes to it. And that was historically actually a way to avoid taxation on extra floors in your building. So they were very tall and steep, and you could actually contain living space inside them. It's not so true of buildings here, although it looks like there's a little attic dormer there, but they were just going for the grandeur of the tall, steep roof line. And often they'll be clad in composition shingles or even slate, but something that tries to kind of mimic slate because that was a very rich material that were often used in France. There'll be minimal ornament, but you'll get things like coining and shutters and interesting surrounds like this. Often in urban areas, you'll get that same kind of facade organization I was talking about earlier, where there's a first-level garage topped by, well, there's not so many bay windows in the French Provincial, but it'll be topped by a pretty major window, and then you'll have an entry off to the side. And I think with this style, too, you can divide it into sub-styles of the Chateauesque and then the Provincial. So I would classify this one here as Provincial. It's pretty simple and small, but you get into the Chateauesque and you think more of the castles of France, and there you might have some interesting turrets and things like that. I think maybe the one on the right here is a little more Chateauesque, something you would drive up to in your luxury car. But it has these pediments on the dormers and a lot of little details and things, dovecotes and such. But it's still very kind of stark and has that imposing roof line that just says French countryside. The one on the left is in San Francisco, and therefore it's a little more hemmed in by other buildings. It's on a narrow lot, and it has the facade organization I was talking about. It does have a square bay up here, and it has the garage with the entry on the side organization, but that's very, very common that you'll see. Coining. Someone asked about coining in the comments there. Let me go back. Coining is this detailing at the corners of the building. So where there's a change in wall plane, you might find these, and they're meant to mimic stones and structural elements at the corners of the building. It's spelled Q-U-O-I-N-I-N-G, so coining. I think French provincial buildings often always have pretty pronounced chimneys too that'll stand up and be kind of independent of the roof line. So that's another indicator. And then we get into Tudor revival. This is where I was saying it goes all the way back to medieval era, and again, trying to evoke the romance of that time period. So this one also kind of has subtypes. There's the English cottage subtype or the castellated subtype. You can think of both of these within the Tudor era. You had the peasants living in cottages and the royals living in their castles, but you know, even the cottage style can be pretty elaborate and large. This is a house in Presidio Terrace. And so some of the most, you'll get a mixture of styles, or of materials on the outside of the building. So here's brick, here's stucco, and then you're having half timbering in areas. And this is actually pretty elaborate half timbering. You've got these little quatrefoil designs here. But, you know, half timbering can be as simple as a few vertical or diagonal wood look members with stucco in between. So those are kind of very indicative of the style. You also have yes, I think it is Diane Feinstein's former home. I don't think she lives there anymore, but it's a great neighborhood if anyone ever goes there. There's a security guard at the gate, but there's typically no one in the truck, so you can just walk on by take a gander at some very, very nice homes there with many interesting styles. So yeah, going back to this, in the cottage style, you're going to have very steep, steeply pitched gable roofs, and this one actually has a thatch look covering, which is amazing. I actually ran into a house down in Carmel recently that had an actual thatched roof, which I can't even imagine how hard that is to maintain, but a lot of them will use composition shingles, and they'll roll the eaves so that they look rounded and look like they're made of thatch. And you'll have barge boards with, these kind of represent protruding structural elements, but there's a certain element of trying to evoke the structure of the building too. You'll get windows with very small panes, and often, if it's very ornate, of leaded glass. Diamond panes are very typical of the style also, and casement windows rather than other things like double hungs or just picture windows. And they'll also have very irregular plans, so you're not going to get a lot of symmetry or formality in the actual organization of the facade. Here's some more examples. The one on the left is a little more castellated, I would say. It has these crenellation or battlements here. These also have coining. You can see that's kind of differentiated from the brickwork around it. You've got molded stone hoods and other things that are meant to look like stone elements. You've got prominent chimneys, kind of like the French provincial style. Tudor arches. Let's see. I'm not sure there's an example of one of those on here, but it's like a pointed arch that's been pressed down, so it's a very wide pointed arch. And then jetties or overhangs, which is, you can see a little bit here, where upper stories will overhang lower stories, and there'll be beam ends sticking out. And just lots of little whimsical details. Eyebrow windows, you'll see, there's none here, but there'll be these little kind of swoopy things that just push up from under the roof, and that's again throws back to that thatching idea, that you'd have a little window or something that kind of pushes up the straw so that it peeks out from the attic. So here's some good half timbering on this little corner turret too. And then we go into the prairie and the American floor style, and this is, whereas all the other styles were very revival-oriented and cast back to older styles, the prairie style, which is very closely related to Frank Lloyd Wright, became purely American and purely modern, and started a trend towards strong modernism that didn't try to replicate anything that came before it. And I kind of lumped American Foursquare in here too. Jonathan mentioned it earlier, so that actually casts as far back as the colonial or the classical revival, excuse me, and colonial revival, but I think it pops up again in the prairie style too. So these had very large, boxy forms. They were usually 2 stories, and if they had any kind of projections, those would be 1 story. Their roofs are very low-pitched and broad with wide eaves, and defined by raptor tails and things. So I always think of the prairie style kind of trying to mimic the prairie and being very spread out and open. They had prominent porches for airflow and sitting on, observing the neighborhood. Massive square supports, and like this chimney here is really, really pretty massive. So wide, flat brick chimneys. And then to get into that Foursquare organization, it would be a facade that's literally divided into kind of a 4-square grid, horizontally and vertically. And it mimics, or it reflects the plan inside the house as well, because that would have, if you're looking at it in plan, would have been a 4-square. So each of these windows would have been in a separate room on each story. So you have this kind of 4-square cube. And that relates more to the form than the actual style. So the prairie style could be applied to it, or in cases like this one here, it's kind of simpler. It's more of that classical look with pretty simple trim and a few little details here and there. But again, this one's a little bit different, but it was altered slightly. There used to be a porch here. But you basically had 1, 2, 3, 4 elements on the facade very symmetrically, and then typically a dormer in the middle of each roof plane. And this is actually a house over in Berkeley that I'm working on, so I think they were very typical in places like Berkeley and some of the less urban areas. And then this house down in the corner here is purely prairie. I had a note written about who it was designed by. It's down in San Jose, and it's called the Call House. I believe it was 1913. Wolf might have been the architect. I could be wrong. But he looks like a pure disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's going with these really modernist forms for the time. And in 1913, it's pretty extreme, but very flat roof, series of windows like this. It's Frank Lloyd Wright all the way. And Frank Lloyd Wright did do work here in the Bay Area, so he was influencing people to do similar style work. Now we move into the Art Deco, which again I said is kind of totally modern and doesn't try to mimic anything, although it does pull in a lot of exotic influences, I would say Asian, South American, Aztec kind of stuff in these chevron designs. You'll get real stylized flowers, figures, lots of geometric kind of shapes and things. So that's Art Deco, I think, of right angles or sharp angles. There's a very vertical emphasis, so you have things like these parapets that are pushing the building towards the sky, kind of radiating out a little bit like starbursts. And these are going to always be clad in stucco because it gave a very flat, smooth finish, and that appealed to the modern sensibility. And you're also going to have flat roofs and very square shapes and forms. Here's some more examples. This one is pretty urban and very modest, but it has still these very vertical piers with these stepped elements that kind of extend them a little further. It's got a stepped parapet here, a little bit of chevron trim along the roof line, but again, flat roofed, very boxy, very plain, other than those elements. This is a strange one. It has a big bay window here, which is actually seems a little earlier, but it's faceted, meaning that it's got, flat, it's made up of flat planes, and then it has these chevrons at the top. And it has a weird little Mediterranean influence over here with the clay tile roofing, but I don't know if there were some alterations that went on there or if it's just kind of a mishmash, but that bay window is pretty distinctly Art Deco. And then Art Deco grew into Art Moderne, or what we call sometimes Streamline Moderne. And it's the opposite of Art Deco in the sense that it is more horizontal than vertical, and it kind of embraces curves and rounded corners rather than sharp angles and right angles. So basically, the Streamline Moderne style was derived from transportation developments of the time, of the 1930s and 40s. We were developing airplanes and ships and trains that were all, people were interested in speed and aerodynamics and the way things moved through the air. So that actually became reflected in housing and buildings, which is interesting. So you've got these rounded corners that if this building could move, might shed the air better. You'll have a lot of horizontal elements like this awning that kind of project slightly, not a lot. Often they'll have speed lines, what we call, or kind of incised horizontal lines, either in these awnings or elsewhere on the surface of the building. Just simple horizontal lines would give that effect of horizontality and movement. Glass block windows are really popular. They're kind of You can't really see out of them, you can't see into them, but they let a lot of light into a room, and they have that interesting geometric grid pattern. And again, like the Art Deco, you're going to have stucco cladding for its clean, smooth lines, and flat roofs and boxy forms. Oh, also, in addition to the glass block windows, you're going to find porthole windows, which again harken to ships and airplanes and things with little round windows. And there's one now. It's not really a window, it's just an opening here by the porch, but that funny little porthole thing. They're going to get parapets, like I was saying, on a lot of them, but they'll have this trim around them. And you'll often, this one actually kind of looks like a ship. It's got this great railing that kind of makes it look like the bow of a ship or something. There's a question, are these homes rare because of the Depression? I think a lot of buildings are rare because of the Depression. These kind of arch into the 40s, and so I don't know, I picture the Art Deco things as being of the 20s and blending into the 30s, and then Art Moderne blending out of the 30s and into the 40s. So there was kind of this, I don't know, dead period during the 30s when not a lot was built, but there were also people that did have the means to build during the Depression. So that there was a Mediterranean revival house that I showed you earlier, and I said that a wealthy family had built it and were able to put a lot of the detailing on it because they could afford it. That one was actually built in 32, I believe. So, you know, things were being built, and sometimes they were rather ornate, but it depended on, you know, the means of the person buying. And a lot of these would often be tract housing or built in small developments, and so on speculation. So there were developers out there, too, that were still trying to make a living during the Depression and build small speculative tracts and sell them off to people. So I wouldn't say that construction completely died during the Depression, but it was, of course, harder and things were more scarce material-wise. So same happened during the war, too, though. There was rationing and labor shortage, and so every era in architecture is heavily influenced by the things that go on around it. It's very interesting. Going a little further ahead is the international style. This gets very, very modern. You've got lots of glass and metal, profuse glazing, so they tried to eliminate as much wall space as possible and put in as much glass to achieve great views and things like that, lighting inside. Again, you're going to have pretty rectangular forms with flat roofs and smooth surfaces. They appreciated asymmetry, so you're going to typically find things with like projecting balconies and different sections of the structure kind of offset from each other. And there's a certain spindliness to it too. I think you can kind of see it in the window muttons here, and even this little post holding up the overhang. Things were very thin and we're kind of showing off that, like, we can make this still stand up even though all the components themselves are very delicate looking. So here's some more examples. This one would be a more modest version. It's in the city in Presidio Heights, but they use here's wood siding. I mean, like we were saying, there's not necessarily a clean division between wood and stucco in terms of the time period, but especially in these later times, they started getting into using cheap materials. You'll see buildings clad with plywood, marine grade plywood to stand up to the elements, or this T111 siding. They started using aluminum window sashes. There's almost a pride taken in doing interesting avant things with cheap materials. So, but again, you have these very boxy forms. Windows will be surrounded by kind of a frame almost, and you get facades that are kind of divided up into, even down here, grids almost, or not necessarily formal symmetrical grids, but they'll be broken into very geometric sections with projecting elements and receding elements. Jonathan talked a bit about the first bay tradition, so this is the second bay tradition. There's also a third bay tradition, which is not, well, it's considered historic, but it's much more modern, so I don't get into it here. But it encompasses the Sea Ranch kind of style. But this is the second bay tradition, and it's also very modern. You can easily confuse it with the international style, but I think it's a little more rustic in the sense that it uses wood siding more. The glazing maybe not quite so profuse, but it comes in these horizontal bands or ribbon windows. You'll get projecting eave lines and these offset, again, levels. So plans were definitely not rectangular. They kind of would get all skewed and angled. And there's a really interesting history behind this style and how it evolved out of the First Bay region tradition. And there's definitely a set number of architects or a set group of architects in the Bay Area that exercise this style almost exclusively. So people like William Worcester, Henry Hill, you'll find their names popping up with buildings that look like these. And they're becoming more of a preservation issue because they're starting to become old enough to be considered historic, and people are starting to recognize and appreciate their kind of avant-garde modernity. So that's something to promote with potential buyers, I suppose. That this is a really, like Jonathan was saying too, a very signature style. We kind of made it our own here in the Bay Area. Someone's picture disappeared, but I see pictures, so I don't know how to fix that. I think this one on the left here is a Henry Hill, and the one on the right is a William Worcester. So I always thought it was interesting, you hear these names, they're very prominent. You think of them as great architects, and then you look at what they did, and it's actually very simple and very modest. You might not even recognize it for what it is when you see it on the street. So it's interesting. And then we get into the mid-century modern, which is much more ubiquitous. I think this house, pink house here, was down in Daly City somewhere, and that's definitely an area where you're going to find this style. It's very modernist, but it's for the everyman. It was often also built kind of speculatively and in tracts and sold to your average home buyer. So they're also going to have very boxy, angular forms, flat roofs with projecting eaves. You'll get big picture windows, lots of unbroken glazing, and then frame-like wall elements, which you don't really see here. It might come up later, but these kind of vertical and horizontal fins that surround windows and things like that. One of the new kind of, you'll see it in past styles too, but one of the new elements of this was the integrated garage. These were designed at a time when the personal automobile was becoming popular and more prevalent throughout the population. So having a house with a garage where you could, have easy access to your car was a big deal. Here's the kind of frame-like element I was talking about, this projecting fin that goes around either a window or a section of facade. And you have these horizontal projections, which are almost like balconies, but not really. Another common feature are wall panels. The buildings will typically be clad in stucco, but then you'll get these horizontal panels of wood cladding sometimes that just kind of provide a little extra articulation to the wall. And these examples are both pretty tame in their color scheme, but like that last one, they kind of lend themselves to a really boisterous colors, so you'll see them painted up. They're the ticky-tacky boxes from the song. And then we go to minimal traditional. And this one, again, strangely, we were going very modern, but this casts back to earlier days, the colonial in some sense. It's trying to capture the American house. Jonathan was talking about how craftsman bungalows kind of symbolize the classic home in America, and I think minimal traditionals also do that. They're going to have very simple kind of monopoly house forms is what I call them. This one's actually fairly urban, and so it's a little bit taller and more vertical, but they'll just have very simple rectangular forms, stucco cladding as well as wood cladding, sometimes both, kind of differentiating levels or portions of the facade. One really indicative thing is the fact there's no eaves. So you'll have gable roofs without or with barely any eaves, just kind of a trim there. You'll get scalloped trim quite a bit, and then also just plain flat wood trim around windows and between story levels. And shutters are also kind of common. They're not real shutters, but faux shutters. And again, these have the integral garages because we're part of the car culture now. I think this one down at the bottom is really kind of a classic example. It has the clapboard siding, so that casts back to traditional American materials for building. This one's a little more mid-century modern. Like Jonathan was saying, styles can be kind of a mishmash. There can be influences of one or the other in a single building. So I think too these little window boxes are pretty typical. You'll see them to put your geraniums on. And then the ranch. You won't find any of these in San Francisco, but you'll find them probably more prevalently out in the suburban and rural areas. These were the kind of, again, you had your garage at one end for your car. You housed your family of 4 and a dog in your classic American home. And they were meant to represent kind of a rustic, rural, casual, American, California even lifestyle. They're often called California ranches, although they're all over the country. But looking for that Western lifestyle, Sunset Magazine lifestyle. They'll often have this huge, wide porch. You'll get big windows with lots of horizontal muttons, or more horizontal than vertical, although there's a grid here that's playing on the modern. But then you'll also have small double-hung windows with shutters to kind of capture a more traditional look. And I think these two can be really divided into 2 types. My title got messed up there, but this one on top is what we would call a storybook ranch. You'll find these, there's amazing ones down in LA and Hollywood, but lots and lots of detail, real rustic-y siding. You'll get these diamond patterned windows, little dovecotes up in the gable ends, stone chimneys, carved supports, porch supports and things, and these real rough wood shake roofs. But then in the opposite extreme, you can have what we call the atomic ranch, and it gets very modern and kind of Jetsony, with angled roof lines and these wide fascia boards. And this one even has a crazy metal support here holding up the projecting corner of the roof. So, but really they all can be classified as ranches because they have that long, sprawling one-story form, and that's what's important in indicating those. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. What I'm going to do, since we're just about out of time here, is I'm going to leave the chat box up while we're doing the rapid quiz session, so people can ask their questions while they're taking the quiz. And we'll start with this first slide here. So if you'd like, you can guess what style this is, and we'll briefly discuss it and then move on to another slide and test your knowledge. This quiz, by the way, is entirely ungraded. It's just for your own fun and knowledge. But if for whatever reason you missed a portion of this session, or you have to make up the session, we'll have a separate 10-question quiz. that will be graded. So if you answer wrong, we won't hold it against you. So it looks like we have most people guessed Edwardian, which seems correct, right, Jonathan?
Yes, although this one is an interesting throwback. This is a fun mix here. This was built after the 1906 earthquake, but it also has some coins down here at the corner, which have been discussed a bunch, and in many ways resembles the bay window Italianates of the 1870s. But overall, it's more Edwardian than anything else, and the people did really well because I think this is the toughest question.
Okay, on to the next, and feel free to ask any questions as we're moving through these. I'm going to pull up the next poll right now. Okay, feel free to begin answering. And this one was mainly identified as Stick East Lake.
I think I may have failed the folks here a little bit.
Uh-oh.
Again, this is an Edwardian style building. A couple of people also said Italianate. It's got that angled bay aspect of Italianate. But one of the things I'd call it in this one is the overall sort of clean look to it. The Stick East Lake one, remember, we've just got, I can see where people think that this linear element is like the linear elements in Stick, but you're looking for that square bay window most of the time, square bay or boxed bay window.
Good to know. And also the top of the building right there, wouldn't that indicate that that's Edwardian as well?
Well, you could see, you'll see this type of cornice on a lot of different buildings. You'll almost always see it on an Edwardian style building. The other one I'd say for Edwardian is this sort of flush wood aspect, very flat. Again, they're trying to be, we've still got some nice ornament here, but we're looking for an overall clean look.
Okay, moving on to the next one. Pulling up the poll question here in a minute. And people seem to be clearly choosing the flat front Italianate for this one.
It's a well-named style. It's again, there's that flat front, and one of the clues that this is certainly Victorian era versus later areas. It's harder to tell here, but there's a real setback from the sidewalk. The problem is that the other buildings are set back, so you can't feel it as much. But yeah, flat front Italianate.
And I think Jeffrey was asking which one are we referring to. Would both of them be considered flat front, or
I'd say both of them. The one on the left would be more the classic one. It's got a little bit more of the details. You notice we have an arched window here, and we have window hoods, and there's a little tabbed parapet, sort of like you might see on the set of an old Western movie, buildings, downtown dusty that might have this sort of flat front with that tabbed parapet. This one is cut from the same cloth. It's a little bit later, and it's got a sort of hip-roofed element right here. So you could call both of them flat front Italianate, but this one would be the more classic example.
okay. On to the next. Pulling up the question. Oops, I have to move this one over. And there's a good mix of responses here, but it's still identified as Second Bay tradition. Caitlin?
Yeah, Second Bay tradition. I can see where it's a little tricky. This is actually a Henry Hill design house, so I think if you had the background knowledge that it was designed by one of San Francisco Bay Area's prominent Second Bay region architects, that would have helped your decision. But looking at it, you can kind of identify maybe the less expensive wood siding that went into it, the way that second story is offset from the front, so there's that very extreme kind of angle of plan that you wouldn't find in the mid-century modern. The mid-century modern would be very boxy and kind of front-on, whereas Second Bay tradition is angled. Also, this particular house sits on Twin Peaks and looks out over the city, and there's a very strong emphasis in the Second Bay tradition of privacy and turning away from the street and having public space versus private space. So if you got a bigger look at this property, it might have been easier to decide, but you did a good job.
On to the next. And this one seems a bit of a trick question, but I think most people may have gotten it, right?
I would actually call it Mediterranean Revival.
Oh, you
It
would?
doesn't
Okay.
have
Yeah.
that, yeah, it doesn't have that big main curvy parapet that Mission typically has. Instead, it does have a parapet, but it's more fine grain. It's more of a tabs parapet. It doesn't have one major element to it. It also, you know, there's a lot of commonalities between all of them, but I would say that cornice is a little bit more classical, so you've got kind of that Renaissance influence. Doesn't have a lot of projecting beam ends and things like that that make it real rustic and would point to Mission. So its overall cleanliness kind of leads me to think Mediterranean.
Great. Okay, moving on to the next one. 1 second here. So Jonathan, this is even more difficult, I think, than the last one, but it looks like most
It
people.
appears to be. I'm going to go, one of the things, this one is actually an Italianate style building. I can see where people, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull the pointer down here. There we go. Um, the One of the things, this is the sort of bay window Italianate, but again, I guess it was sort of more difficult if you held your hand across the top of that building and got rid of this gable roof element. I think it would have been easier for people. One of the clues here, I would say, are the arched windows that we're seeing up here. We talked a little bit about the fact that Italianate style at the period would use these arched windows a little bit more. Again, the Stick East Lake would be a square bay, which would be very squared, yet this is angled. Some people also call it a chamfered bay because of the shape.
Excellent. And somebody apparently chose Italianate after you discussed it, so
There we
somebody
go.
got it right. Um, all right, on to the next. Second. Question
This was a
8. There's
harder
one
quiz
more
than I
after.
remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be given this one.
I thought for a second I hadn't activated the poll because there were no answers, and I guess it was just because people were still trying to think through it. Okay, so the winner in this case is Mediterranean Revival. Uh, what do you think, Caitlin?
This is not my picture, but
Did I put
I
this
think
one
the
in here?
one, I think you did. I think the one on the far left looks a little Mediterranean-y. It's got the clay roof and the kind of applied window frames, but I think, I don't know,
Maybe
Jonathan,
they're referring to the
Edwardian?
one on the
I
left
I
because
would go with, for these, I would say that these were being built at the same time Mediterranean Revival buildings were in their heyday.
Mhm.
But actually, this could almost be a no vote, or a just call it a vernacular one. Um, this looks to me, and you'll forgive me, it's been a long time since I looked at this slide. These look to me like buildings of the mid-1920s, probably in the Marina District. But they're overall the same period as Mediterranean Revival, but they're kind of their own thing. But I agree with Caitlin, those red clay tile accents you can see on the building at the far left um, would push that one over the edge with the name Mediterranean Revival as good as any for that one.
I think you can say in San Francisco that there's a lot of different styles that are applied to the ubiquitous bay-windowed row house kind of form. So it's a strange place with strange buildings. I would guess these were like a tract too, that they were all built by the same person.
oh, forgive me,
Oh,
that's
these
the
are
wrong
hard.
question. That's the wrong question. Okay, there's I pulled up the wrong poll question, but here is the correct question. Um, yeah, this was the hard one I remember from last time as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, like we said, there's no style that's really purely anything specific. There's a lot of mixture going on.
Maybe we can give a little hint there. This one, I believe this is a Mabeck house.
Yeah.
So this is designed by one of the Starchitects, if you will, of the early 20th century, late 19th, and we'll just say turn of the century, although he continued practicing well into the 20th century. But this is a sort of famous house of his.
And given it was Mabeck, I'm surprised only one person answered Craftsman,
Hmm.
but now two have, I guess.
I think. Do you want to take this one, Caitlin? I think the majority got it mostly right.
Yeah, I mean, Bernard Mabeck's considered to be a First Bay tradition architect, but he definitely threw a lot of Gothic or Tudor and Gothic elements in here with the, leaded glass diamond pane windows and those these quatrefoil elements. I can't get the arrow. Yeah, there
And
it
the
is.
false hat and the half timbering look, which is really,
Yeah,
really Tudor Revival, which is I
right.
think what
Half
some people are
timbering,
reacting to.
deep pitched roof with slate tiles. So, I think I would call it First Bay region, but he was definitely using a lot of very revival style influences and throwing them all together to create this very arts and crafts unusual style of his own.
Yep.
This is the Roos house, by the way. The inside's fantastic. Still has all of his original furniture that he designed for it.
And the final question. Everybody says
Okay.
Queen Anne in this case.
I think everybody is mostly right. This is another one. These are really hard, John. I'm going to make these easier next time. This is transitional, turn of the century transitional, and the form is most definitely Queen Anne, two-story bay-windowed Queen Anne. But here we don't have so much of the Queen Anne ornament, the fish scale shingles and the porch spindle work. So this one is transitioning turn of the century Queen Anne into the buildings of the Edwardian era.
Wonderful. And if anybody has any questions, please speak now or forever hold your peace. Of course, if you'd like either of the speakers' contact information, as long as they don't mind me giving it out, I can have you ask them questions individually. But if you have any right now, please do so. I saw somebody starting to type something in, but I don't see it anymore. In any case, we're going to provide the PDF and all the resources you would need from this session after the session. I'll send it to you by this evening. And the final step for this is to have you take the evaluation, if you wouldn't mind. It helps us improve the programs, and you can type in written responses on the bottom of the page. I wanted to thank both of our speakers for today. Wonderful presentations. Even though I've seen it twice now, it's different every time, so thank you both. And I wanted to also remind you that the third part of this four-part series will be occurring on the 19th of November at 2:30 p.m. City regulations and design guidelines. If you miss any session in these 4 sessions, you have the ability to make up your session. All you have to do is visit learn.californiapreservation.org, type in your email address and the password that you used to log into this session today, and the quiz should appear anywhere from 1 to 5 business days after the session. All you have to do is complete the 10-question quiz, and you're marked as complete for that session. If you attended the live session, you're not required to take the quiz. So for those of you who are here now, you have passed part 2, and I look forward to seeing you for part 3. If you wouldn't mind, please hit the submit response button at the top of the page. So you have to fill out the multiple choice responses here, then scroll back up to the top and press submit response. Otherwise, we won't receive your response. Thanks again, everybody, and I apologize for going a bit over time today, but we hope it was useful for you. And everybody enjoy your day. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.